more than anything, I wanted to become a member of the Brigade of Midshipmen of the United States Naval Academy. I began picturing myself as a midshipman at Navy with my hand held up, swearing to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. With that singular image in my mind, the things I needed to do started manifesting themselves. The Academy required academic excellence. Fortunately, I had good grades. But the school was asking for a lot more than just good grades. And up until that point, my extracurricular activities were really limited. I knew that if I didn't step up, I would never get in. And fear became my greatest motivator. The school required a physical fitness test. Keeping the image in my mind, I started exercising with purpose. Push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, and a run for time. I joined the Key Club and started participating with earnest. I sang in my church choir and praised God with my greatest voice. I tried out for a local school play, and while I only had a small part, I had fun learning everyone's lines. Opportunities started to present themselves. I was chosen to be mayor of the city where I lived for a day, and later I was selected to represent my school at Boise State. As I thought about getting into the Naval Academy, I realized I was having fun doing a lot of cool things. And while it would be devastating if I didn't get in, I knew I would be better off for my efforts. Then one February, my senior year, a letter came in. My mind started racing. My hands got sweaty. Would I get in? Could I take the rejection if I didn't? I said a short prayer and I opened the letter. The Academy invited me to become a member of the Brigade Shipmen, and I was so ecstatic. I started hooting and hollering. I was doing cartwheels. I did it, I was in. Since that day, I've had other dreams, other big dreams. And in each case, I would picture where I wanted to be, and I would visualize what I would be doing and who I would be doing with when I got there. As the saying goes, you can't make a basket if you never take the shot. I knew I would miss the shot sometimes, and the failure would dampen my spirit, but I would be better off for my efforts and I would be okay. Remarkably, my visualization has helped me achieve most of my goals. And what I learned along the way is it didn't take twice as much effort. It only took an extra 10%. You might ask, how is that possible? Well, let me give you an example. Fall semester, my senior year at the Naval Academy, I had the chance to try out flying. My first plane I would ever fly is the Varga Kachina. After 6 flights in 8 hours, I would get the opportunity to solo. Now, it's one thing to fly alongside a qualified instructor pilot with thousands of hours. It's another thing to fly for the very first time solo. I remember sitting at the end of the runway with my checklist complete, and I suddenly felt all alone. I was paralyzed with fear. What if something goes wrong? What if my plane crashes? I was so scared I broke out into a cold sweat. Shoving the fear from my mind, I visualized myself flying my airplane and landing it safely. I then pushed the power up, started my takeoff roll, and with my instructor in the tower on the radios, I completed my first, then my second touch and go, and on the third time around, I landed safely and came to a complete stop. Woohoo! I just cheated death, and I loved it. On service selection night, I chose naval aviation, and I never looked back. Before I could begin flight training, I had to prove I was proficient in the water. There were a ton of tests. Treading water for 20 minutes, swimming for a mile in a flight suit. But the scariest of them all was the Dilbert Dunker. The Dilbert Dunker was a jet crash simulator. Now, the idea of crashing a jet into the ocean scared the heck out of me, but at least I would have the training in case it ever happened. I remember climbing up the stairs to the platform for the Dunker, and watching my classmates one by one get tested in front of me. Once strapped in, the dunker dropped 15 feet, slammed into the water, and flipped over. It seemed like forever before each of my classmates came to the surface. Finally, it was my turn. As I stepped into the dunker, my body got chilled as I sat in that wet, cold seat and harness wrapping around me. I suddenly started hyperventilating. Get it together, Pete. You can do this. I visualized myself completing the process and swimming safely to the surface. The instructor hit the button. The dunker dropped faster and hit harder than I had imagined. I stole one gasp of breath before the water came up over my head, and then I flipped over. It seemed like forever before we hit the bottom, and by the time I reached there, I was out of breath. I tugged on my harness, and it released. Free, I made my escape. By the time I broached the surface, my lungs were screaming for air, and I gasped for breath. I did it, I passed. A few weeks later, I started flight training. And before each flight, I pictured those gold Navy wings being pinned on my chest. A year later, Scott Orchard and I graduated with distinction. Scott had had 400 hours in his private pilot's license before he began. I had 8 hours and one solo flight in the Varga Kachina, that extra 10%. Now, a few years later, I was a qualified P-3 Orion patrol plane commander leading a crew of 12. I remember one Saturday night, we were over the ocean tracking a submarine. We had flown for about 8 hours, and we were finished, and we were ready to head home when base command called and said to extend as long as possible. What's an extra 30 minutes going to matter at this point anyway, I thought. And with 4 engines, we routinely shut down the left outboard engine in order to save gas. And so with this command, we'd have to shut down another engine. So before doing so, though, I checked my operating engines and saw how they were doing. The left inboard engine was fine, but the right one was acting erratically. My training took over. With a bona fide emergency, I aborted the mission. And instead of shutting down the second engine, I restarted the number 1 engine. And when it was up and running fine, we checked the number 3 engine again. The oil pressure was going crazy. This emergency required us to shut down the engine. And a few seconds after we pulled the emergency shutdown handle, a bright red fire warning light illuminated the pitch black cockpit, and a loud fire warning horn went off. It scared the heck out of us. A few seconds later, the aft observer screamed, "Sir, we got flames coming back out of the back of the number 3 engine." I had over 800 hours of flight time, and this was the first real engine fire I had ever witnessed. I called for the emergency shutdown checklist for an engine fire, and on the 3rd step, we set a circuit breaker that shut off oil to the engine. A few seconds later, the fire went out. We all breathed a sigh of relief, completed the checklist, declared an emergency, and then started heading home. As I pushed the power levers up, 20 seconds later, the fire warning light and horn came back on. Dear God, I prayed, please don't let me die tonight. A few seconds later, the aft observer screamed, "Sir, we have flames coming out of the back of the number 3 engine again." My worst fears were confirmed. There was no procedure in the manuals for a scenario like this. My dream that night was to bring my crew and my plane home safely. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep it together to give my crew the best chance of survival. I quickly pictured my family and then got about a way to figure out how to get the flames out. With my power levers up, I dove the airplane towards the ocean. I knew if I didn't get the fire out, I would have to ditch. As we passed 1,200 feet and got to 265 knots, the aft observer screamed, "Sir, fire out on number 3. With that good news, the whole plane erupted in cheers. And with the emergency abated and my adrenaline depleted, my hands shook uncontrollably. It would be 11 hours before we finally landed the airplane where I'd been flying. By the time I got home, I was so exhausted that I was asleep before my head hit the pillow. The next morning, I hugged my family and told them what had happened. A few years later, I completed my military obligation and decided to leave the Navy, the only thing I had known since I was 18. I had a yearning to enter the business world and decided the best way for me to do that was to get an MBA. And upon graduation, I joined the Coca-Cola company. And after 5 years in finance, I was bored crunching numbers. I dreamed of joining the marketing department where the work looked to be much more fun and exciting. There, I would get to travel and work on cool projects. Through visualization, I landed a job on the sponsorship negotiations team, and I got to do deals with the NHL, with NASCAR, and the Atlanta Olympic Games. Through my success with the Atlanta Olympic Games, I got the opportunity not to work on just one Olympics, but 8 different times. I couldn't believe my good fortune. One of my greatest accomplishments was working with a woman named Gabriella on the 2004 Olympics in Sochi, Russia. My job was to create a Coca-Cola pin trading center. Since 1896 in Athens, pin trading had become the #1 spectator sport at the Olympics. If we were successful, this would be the 15th consecutive Olympics where Coca-Cola had a pin trading center. But from the outset, we were faced with one project-ending challenge after another. 4 months before the Olympics began, our pin manufacturer threatened to quit. And while I was able to resolve the problem, Gabriella grew worried. Picture yourself inside the Coca-Cola pin trading center at the Olympics, I urged. Still, problems kept popping up. Something wasn't right. I decided to make one more trip to Moscow. I remember greeting her that cold December day. Her face was distraught. She blurted, "Pete, our retailer just quit." My heart sank. Oh no, not again. If we couldn't find a replacement, we were toast. We scrambled, and miraculously by week's end, we had found a backup. 2 months later, I exclaimed, "Gabriella, we're here, sitting in the Coca-Cola pin trading center just as we pictured." She said, "Pete, I believe because you believe." Not only was this one of the greatest compliments I've ever received, but it let me know that my visualization could help others achieve their own dreams. So I ask you, do you have a dream to do something big, something bold, something almost impossible to accomplish? Then I say, picture that dream. Visualize what you will be doing and who you will be doing with when you've accomplished it. The visualization will give you the clarity to know what to do and the determination to go that extra 10% to make it happen. Never let go of that dream. Not only will you accomplish it, but you will become an inspiration for dozens, if not hundreds of others who dare to dream of achieving theirs. In the words of Walt Disney, if you can dream it, you can do it. Thank you.